Ladies and gentlemen, we come now to the most famous portrait in our gallery, the most famous in the world. Her smile has bewitched and baffled art critics for centuries, but now, ever since the art restoration in 2016, we've realized the truth about that smile. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Mona Lisa. Since 1503, people have wondered, what on earth is she smiling about? And now we know. She's smiling at minorities. I mean, what else can we conclude? What other explanation is there? She is a symbol of the smirking, sneering elites, oozing Italian privilege. She is the epitome of Renaissance superiority. She reminds me of my ex-girlfriend. Model good looks, but you turn your back for 1 minute and she's off with Owen Gower. Owen Gower! Stuck-up pig, honestly. I mean, you can see it, can't you? When you just look at the smile for long enough, it's obvious when it's pointed out. I mean, I say smile, really it's a smirk. It's a sneer. She is frozen in a rictus grin of pure hatred. I mean, just standing there, staring you down, menacing, aggressive.
There's something aggressive about standing there.
Standing there with her no doubt racist grin of race-based racism. If when my back is turned, you want to walk up to the painting and punch her in the face, honestly, no one could blame you. And by the way, I've got Da Vinci's details if you want to dox him later. Just ask me. Right, well, enough of her. Next on the tour, it is the Laughing Cavalier, or as we call him here, that smirking bigot. LIVEcast, welcome to the LIVEcast, welcome to the show. LIVEcast, welcome to the LIVEcast, welcome to the show. Welcome.
Hello, welcome to the LIVEcast.
Hey.
Good to see you all again, or,
yes.
Well, can't see you at all, but
well,
I presume you're there somewhere.
We can see you in comments. So, Biddy has already said hello. Dan Rackham has joined. Hello, Dan Rackham.
Mine says that Glen Scrivener is watching with me, so that's good to know.
I'm always watching, Paul. Yeah, in the background. And if you have any comments about today, please do tap them into your little Facebook comment stream, and we will ignore them for the next hour. No, we won't ignore them. If we see them in time, we'd love to interact with what you have to say.
Mm-hmm. So, Glen.
Yes. The
Mona Lisa.
The Mona Lisa. Inspired, right?
Yeah. My real question is, who's Owen Gower?
Owen Gower. Owen Gower really was. He was at my school, and an ex-girlfriend of mine dumped me for Owen Gower.
Man.
And in my school, Owen, if you're listening, I forgive you. All is forgiven. And but
as we speak, members of the Speak Live Facebook page are finding his details, doxing him and his
family.
family.
It's such a common Welsh name, I'm sure. Don't get the wrong one, okay? Just make sure.
No, so Mona Lisa, what's that really about? What's going on there?
Yeah, it's good to get me off the Owen Gower thing, because I think Owen Gower.
Owen.
I actually, I was a prefect at my school, and I had the ability to give out detentions, and usually it was for like first formers who were being snot-nosed. I gave Owen Gower a detention.
Wow. What was it? Did you cite the reason?
Obstreperous behaviour.
Obstreperous.
Anyway, so yeah, the Mona Lisa. So if you didn't catch the reference, it's in reference to the Covington Catholic High School, the MAGA kid who, as I said last week, I'm not the biggest fan of making countries great again and all that kind of stuff. And if you are, that's got nothing against you.
Knock yourself out.
Knock yourself out. But I don't mind that kind of thing, and I hope that was clear last week, that I was actually standing up for the kid who happened to be in a MAGA hat. But I did think that because he had the MAGA hat on, people were viewing his smile
in a particular way.
In a very particular way. And people were imagining all sorts of things about his internal worlds, about his life, about his history, about his politics, about everything about this kid.
I can almost hear, though, someone saying, yeah, it's almost like seeing someone in Nazi uniform suggests they're bad.
Right. Yeah.
What would we say to that?
Like, can you honestly establish an equivalency between... Honestly, I'm thinking no.
I did see someone put on a comment, not on our thing, it was on, other YouTube videos. They were like, it's like looking at the Hitler Youth. They said that.
Yeah,
literally said that.
Yeah.
So,
and isn't it interesting how,
you know, such a person might walk around in a Che Guevara t-shirt.
Yeah.
Right? Such a person
you
might
like Che
have...
Guevara? Who?
And, you know, yeah.
They don't even know who he is.
He seems cool, you know. Motorbike, right? Was he a
John-
motorbike? You know. And so, yeah. So can we interpret other people and where they're coming from charitably? And so, yeah, what I was...
I think we know the answer, Glenn. Come on.
Clearly, from experience, we know that we can't, unfortunately. So I was just imagining to myself, is there a famous smile which we might look at in a different way if we saw them through a different frame? And there you go.
And that is
now you have my process.
the most famous smile you could think of.
Yeah, I don't know. Julia Roberts, she's got a pretty famous smile, but yeah.
The Joker.
Not one of pure joy, but
It's like there's something malevolent in his sinister grin.
chaotic evil. That's him. But yes, so that was my frame. Well, that was rather my motivation for doing this. That actually the frame that we look through really determines what we see. And I thought that story from, I guess it's 10 days old now, but that story is still doing the rounds. Because it is such an interesting example of looking at something through one little frame and coming to one snap judgment, and then a whole bunch of people doubling down on it, tripling down on it. Yeah. Can we reframe things and see them in a different light? That's what we're talking about today. So the art of persuasion, and one of the things that you want to do with the art of persuasion is reframe things. So often I talk about the 4 R's when you're in a conversation with somebody, and let's say that they've asked you a tricky question about Christian faith, or they've objected to some aspect of the Bible. I often talk about 4 R's that you can think through. One of them is reframe, but all 4 of them are: you should relate to the question and to the questioner. You should kind of say, look, if they've raised a question like suffering, how can a good God allow a suffering world? You can relate to it and just say, hey, you know, I live in that same suffering world too, and, you know, I don't know if you know what a hard time we had last year, and it really made me wrestle with God and my faith and all sorts of things. So you relate to the question, because it's not like you're just entrenched in your position. And you say, look, I too have that question. So you relate, but you also reflect the question, because they too need an answer to their own question. So you reflect it back, and you start asking, you know, so what do you do about suffering? How do you deal in this suffering world? Because every question that you are asked, the questioner needs to answer some version of that. So you relate, you reflect, but also you reframe the question. And you start to ask, you know, people, is there another way of seeing this? And, you know, the example with Covington High is, yeah, there were loads of angles that you could actually, you know, see things from. And if you took the time, you could wade through 2-hour-long videos about, you know, what was happening. And I think we need to do that in all kinds of walks of life. Ask ourselves, is there another way of seeing this? Is a particular perspective being forced on me that is not necessary? And could I perhaps reframe or redefine the terms of the question? So when somebody says, how could a good God allow a suffering world? One of the key terms you need to reframe is God. Like, which God are we talking about? Is it a God who could have nothing to do with suffering, or is it the God who is revealed at the cross as a God who gives himself in flesh and blood for the world? If we're talking about that kind of God, then that reframes the whole question. And then the final R is retell. You know, you present the gospel again with this issue at its core, and you can do that with whatever is asked. But with suffering, it's obvious. We begin without suffering. Suffering is on us because we've turned from God. God enters into that suffering in Jesus and rises up again to offer us his future. So you retell the gospel again with that issue at its core. And but really the R that I was wanting to focus on is the reframe one. I think we need to be doing that a lot more, so that when people ask us a question, we don't assume that the terms they use are the same terms that we use, and that their assumptions will be our assumptions. And we just need to be much better at kind of going to 30,000 feet and looking down on the subject a little bit more, detaching from our own entrenched positions, and asking ourselves and asking others, is there another way of seeing this? Because I do think that people can be persuaded. So this last week I came across a vlogger called Matt Christensen, who's very popular on YouTube, and it seems like he's on a journey. And and I probably listened to about 10 of his videos now, just in this last week, sort of fell down the YouTube hole, as you tend to do. And one of his latest videos is about the New York State abortion law, or reproductive health law, I think they called it.
Yep.
Reproductive health. Now, there's a term that needs reframing, right? Is this about reproductive health, or is this about the status of the unborn? So I just thought it was really interesting, and we're going to see a clip now about how he, who is just kind of grown up with a kind of a default pro-choice position, has been thinking about things and what it is that has persuaded him on his journey. I think we can learn a lot from it. So let's have a look at Matt Christensen.
On Tuesday, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo signed broad legislation expanding access to abortion in his state, and he did it on the 46th anniversary of the Roe v. Wade decision, with the actual lawyer who argued the case before the Supreme Court at his side, Sarah Weddington. She was 27 years old at the time. As far as the content of the new law, it takes abortion out of the state's criminal code entirely, now regulating the issue as a matter of public health, which means that previous law that criminally banned acts that harm a fetus in utero and banned abortions after 24 weeks except if the mother's life is at stake is now out the window. It expands the pool of people who can legally perform abortions to include non-physicians. It allows abortions up to point of birth if the fetus is non-viable or the mother's health is at risk. And that's not just the mother's life at risk, mind you, that's the mother's health. It's a much looser term that assuredly will be interpreted much more loosely. The law also removes existing protections for babies that survive an abortion procedure, meaning medical professionals no longer have an obligation to care for a child that survives the process, at least as far as New York State is concerned. And predictably, this new law is given a nice, wholesome title. It's the Reproductive Health Act, as though we're talking about taking your vitamins and drinking plenty of water during your pregnancy. And this new law has been heavily discussed this week, with critics seeing it as yet another sign of our decaying moral integrity. There's even a push to get Governor Cuomo excommunicated from the Catholic Church over his betrayal of their values. As far as my take, if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I'm a recovering former firmly pro-choice filthy lefty, nudged an inch or two over with each episode of some shout your abortion lady telling me that an abortion is nothing more than ordering fast food or visiting the dentist.
But abortion shouldn't be a luxury. It should be on the dollar menu at McDonald's. Hey, I'd like a large Diet Coke, and can you get this egg out of my McMuffin?
And then they just suck the pregnancy out. And it was like a crappy dentist appointment or something. Then it was over, and I felt really just grateful that I wasn't pregnant anymore.
And even though we're supposed to treat this as routine and mundane, we're also supposed to celebrate it as some kind of achievement too.
Abortion, I salute you! Women, if you need an abortion, get one!
There's nothing like philosophical alignment with that type of degeneracy to get the gears of introspection spinning in your head, and over the last couple of years, I've done exactly that. Truth be told, it wasn't just running far, far away from the Michelle Wolfs of the world that's behind my intellectual shift. There was a simple, solid case made by former Libertarian presidential and Senate candidate Austin Peterson on Dave Rubin's show 2 summers ago, and it really sticks in my head.
The question in my mind is it a life? Is it a human life? I think the answer to that question is yes. And then it gets down to the question of, well, when does life begin? Well, can I be intellectually honest and say I don't know because I'm not a scientist and that I don't know everything? But if I'm to make a mistake, I would probably think it would be the moral question is, should you err on the side of life? So I think that, yes, we should err on the side of life.
And when I considered what he said, I really didn't have a great refutation. If there's a human life at stake at some point in this process, even if we can't say exactly when that life begins, it's probably prudent to protect that life amid any doubt. That's if you grant that there is, in fact, a life at stake at some point in this process. But if I don't grant that, then I'm firmly with old kazoo voice Michelle, and I can't hang out with her. I'll lose my mind. So that deals with the moral question to me. That tells me what a moral person would and should do in such a circumstance. The legal question still eludes me a bit, but if we grant that there is, in fact, a life at stake in this process, I have no qualms with people who view it as the state's role to protect it. Protecting life is a fundamental, foundational role for government as we've conceived it. And I don't think it makes you some big government hypocrite to think that protection ought to extend to the unborn. So I'm sympathetic to that broad legal concept. I'm still undecided on some specific exceptions and who ought to be punished, those sorts of questions. But there's a secondary conclusion to which Austin's case leads me, where there's ambiguity.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, lots of good stuff in there.
Yeah.
Very well, just kind of, to me, well thought out.
Yeah.
Kind of just acknowledging the different aspects of it that he's seen and being prepared to think about it.
Yeah, and being prepared to cross an aisle that is very, very broad, very, very wide. It's a foul, wide ditch, really, especially in American culture. And yet, you know, he's been on a journey. I think people can be persuaded, and I just thought it was interesting as he traced out what it was that was persuading him. And you know, so he was first persuaded on the moral question, and he still has questions about legality and what the role of the state and all that kind of stuff. And I'm sure he's got all sorts of other moral issues that he's wrestling through as well. But the way in was just that question: is it a life? Is it a human life? And even if you don't know, can you be sure?
Yeah, it's like the example you talked about the building being demolished.
Right.
You know, and the person saying, is there anyone still in there?
Yeah.
And you go, I'm not sure. You know,
I think
think everyone's out. I think there's
no.
no one in there. You go, well, you know, wouldn't you want to be sure before you
press the detonator?
Yeah, and if you're not sure, you don't want to press that detonator. So
Yeah. Or, you know, you're out hunting and there's a rustle in the bushes and you're not 100% sure it's not a human being.
Yeah.
do you shoot if you're not 100% sure? So, yeah, erring on the side of life. And then everything else kind of falls out of that. And I do think as a principle of persuasion, like you can't answer everybody's objections all at once. There's a debating tactic called hurling elephants, where you just, there's this thing and there's this thing and there's this thing and there's this thing, and like it's not joined up thinking, it's not an argument, it's just hurling elephants.
Not really interested in the response to those either. It's just
Right.
let me throw another one at you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, what do you do when elephants are being hurled at you? You know, I just think it's, you know, is there a way of just saying, okay, you know, let's imagine that all of what you just said is true. Can I just get your thought on this one question? Like, what is in the womb? Like, what is it? And are you sure of what's in the womb? And would it change your mind? Would it change your mind if it could be conclusively shown that what is in the womb is a human life? Would that change your mind? You know, and I think you might get into a better kind of conversation on that. So yeah, I think people can be persuaded, and people can even be persuaded from very entrenched positions. And just this week, I shared Stephanie Gray's Google Talk, which you came across this week as well. Yeah.
Well, because you shared it.
Because I shared it.
And then I
We're
watched
friends.
it.
We're friends.
Yeah. We do speak outside of work as well.
Yeah. What did you make of Stephanie Gray's Google Talk?
Yeah, really, really good. Really surprised to see it on a Google thing. I assumed they'd be more censorious. But yeah, I thought she was great. She was very kind of, she just seemed to be very well thought out. It wasn't aggressive or hostile in any way. She simply brought different ideas. I mean, she talked a lot about, you know, I met somebody and we were having a conversation and they said this, and so I asked a question back, and that was often the repeated idea. And she said, well, what about from this angle? So I guess that's kind of what you're getting at in the sense of this reframing.
Yes.
That, you know, I think the example she used, or someone had used to her about the, you know, you've got the baby on your right and you've got the embryo on your left, and there's the fire, and who do you save and whatnot? And they feel like the obvious answer is, well, of course you save a baby, and, you know, because life is more valuable or something like that, you know. And she just reframes it with the idea of the, you know, the woman on the car in the river. You know, woman's crashed a car in the river, she's on the roof holding her baby, you know, the person swims out to save them. Who do they save first? Well, you go for the weaker one, you know, and everyone would say, well, save the baby, you know.
Right. Yeah.
And she's saying, you know,
That's
don't you think it's great that we, you know, we want to help those who are weaker? Isn't that our natural thing?
Yeah.
It's not about saving the strong. And that resonates with people, you know.
Yeah.
I think that does, and she just does it. She seems to have done it in a very natural way. I mean, obviously, I think she said in the video the video's maybe 2 years old or so. She was 37. She'd been doing it since she's 18. So I mean, she's had a good 20 years of practice as well in these kind of conversations. So
It shows.
yeah, very
It
much
shows.
so.
She's very, very good. So all sorts of reframing is going on in that video. I've just put a link down in the Facebook comments. Do check it out because she's reframing the whole time. That's essentially what she does. So she starts. She has a story about Captain Sullenberger, Sully.
Sully, yeah.
So if you've seen
the film,
the Clint Eastwood film
Tom Hanks.
about him, and you might have remembered, he's the guy who landed the plane on the Hudson.
Yeah.
And at the end, as the plane is sort of slowly sinking into the Hudson, you know, he's going up and down, up and down. He's the last person off the plane because we all know that self-sacrifice for the sake of life is noble, honourable, valiant.
Captain should be last one off.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing.
And let's try to be heroes. Let's try to be heroes so that, you know, the script that we run is not the script of what is my choice and rights and autonomy, but how do I be a hero? How do I live that self-giving life? So
she said, you know, we look to those people, don't we?
Right.
And we see those things, and we say, yes, that is inspiring, that is honourable, that is right. Because you contrasted that very well with the Costa Concordia cruise liner disaster, where the captain left the ship before, you know, everyone else or a lot of other people, and people died, and he said he just fell out. I mean, he literally. He said he fell into a lifeboat, and I mean, it's like Aaron, you know.
yeah, that's it.
I just put the gold in the fire, and this calf came out.
And this cowardice just came out. I don't know.
So, and she was able to contrast those just well and say, you know, the big scandal in that story was, yes, there was a big disaster, and yes, people died, but the other big thing was this thing about the captain left the ship, and everyone was like, this is terrible. You don't do that. And look at the example of Sully. And actually, it's this idea of when you put aside your own rights for the sake of others, that is something that we think is good and honourable. So how come in the abortion situation we're saying, actually, I want to have my rights curtail the rights of someone else? And it's not just curtailing the rights of someone else. I mean, it's killing someone else. You know, there's a you know, there are definitely situations where sometimes you would want to fight your own rights.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
But
I
perhaps
think something trumps
something that kills someone else is probably not the one. But
yeah, the right to life is the right from which other rights flow, because without it, you don't have any other rights. She does another brilliant reframing thing about, you know, what do you do in the question where you know that a baby won't survive outside the womb? And of course, there are loads of stories about people being told that, you know, the child won't survive outside the womb, and here they are today. You know, my mother was offered an abortion with me. I had a twin. She had miscarried the twin, and I'd survived. But because she miscarried the twin, the doctor said, well, something's probably not right. Probably best to terminate the pregnancy.
right, yeah.
And of course she didn't, and you know, I'm perfectly okay, sort of. You know, I'm all right. You know,
And I mean, I've read numerous. I know people as well, but I've read numerous cases of people who've been told, you know, this child has Down syndrome, you should abort, and they don't,
Right.
and the children are perfectly healthy.
not that they should, even if there was. But
Well,
yeah,
no, exactly.
But yeah,
I know, but that was the line from the hospital.
people
the
think,
doctors.
there is a claim to know more than we actually do know in those circumstances.
And I mean, I think the story as well from John Wyatt. I don't think it was on the interview, but he spoke when he mentioned it at the conference. He used the example of a baby at All Souls Langham Place, who I think he had something called Edwards syndrome,
Yes.
and parents were told that he wouldn't live, you know, past about a week or so, if that long, and they should terminate. But they had the baby, and he said, like, and everybody loved this baby. You know, he became like a minor celebrity at All Souls Langham Place. And everybody wanted to pass him round, and you know, and he lived for 7 months, and he said like 400 people came to the funeral, and he said like when he was born, I think he said he weighed about 5 pounds or something, and he said when he died at 7 months he was still 5 pounds, and he said that someone said to the dad something like, I'll get this right now, he said, you know, I can't remember the baby's name, but he said he never grew, but he taught others how to, or he helped us to,
Right.
And actually, you know, I mean, how can you put a price on that, you know, and say like, well, I mean, they were told he wouldn't survive. I mean, 7 months is a good long period. and he touched so many people's lives.
Right.
Like,
right. So she does this reframing thing, Stephanie Gray, where she says, you know, what about a baby who won't survive outside the womb? As though we know that. But then she reframed it and said, well, imagine you have a loved one who's on the other side of the country and they've got 4 weeks to live. Do you wait until 3 weeks and 6 days before you go and visit them and just have the shortest amount of time with that loved one that you can? Or do you not move heaven and earth to be with that other person and spend as long as you can with that other loved one? And you're like, you know, just reframing.
Yeah.
It's very persuasive.
absolutely.
She was asked about her approach. So the video's gone viral at sort of 160,000 views, and it's a really good one. I've been on a couple of different comment streams, even just this week, where people seem at least open to being persuaded or hearing the best case for a pro-life position, and this is definitely the video that I've given for people to have a look at. And when she was asked about her approach in this video, she said, "Everyone is pro-life, they just don't know it yet." And I thought that was very interesting, because she's like, well, come on, I think we're all actually on the side of life. We might be mistaken about the status of the unborn, and but it's the rare person who says, yes, I know that's a human child, I don't care.
Yeah,
ha, ha, ha.
absolutely.
Right. Everyone is pro-life, they just don't know it yet. And I think that gives you a kind of a cheerful confidence to be able to reason your case and to hope for the best for the other person, that actually, yeah, they've thought in twisted ways about this subject, and perhaps if I bring clarity in this way, they can be released into what they deep down believe.
And I think having that kind of that optimism about people coming over to the same side helps you in when you talk about it with people. So I mean, you can, if you think people can be persuaded. So I'm in the middle of a conversation, which I won't go into the details of, with someone about this topic, but I very much kind of laid my cards on the table and I said, look, I'm not being judgmental about people who've had abortions or perform abortions. My hope is that people who perform abortions will step away from it and sort of come to repentance, and people who've had abortions will be able to come and be forgiven and receive the healing and forgiveness they need. And I think when you talk about it, you may make the same arguments, but as other people. But if other people might make the same arguments and spend their whole time describing people who've had abortions or give abortions as murderers,
right?
Which, you know, people might want to have a discussion about that. But it certainly doesn't put people on the foot to change their mind, does it?
Yeah.
If you're saying you believe in murder, you endorse murder,
right,
already you're setting up a barrier to do that. But if you're saying, look, come over here with me.
Come over here. Yeah, if that's your goal. Because otherwise, it's like, I just want to flame you and just grind you into the dust and leave. Like, isn't that, you know, what so much of these interactions are about? But if you actually have hope that the other person can be persuaded, that should totally change the tone, the tenor, the content of what you say. That you actually want to be friends at the end of this conversation, and you actually, you know, and it shows a confidence in the truth of your position.
Well, and exactly, someone put on, I think on that Stephanie Gray video, they said, someone else had written a comment and said they'd seen her in an debate with someone else, and the other person had just resorted to kind of snarky comments and ad hominem attacks, and she just kept her cool and just carried on as she was. And I mean, that just shows something completely different, isn't it? I don't need to come back at these things. I don't need to attack the person. I can just bring this and let it be, let it speak for itself, really.
Yes, yeah. So let's have that sort of cheerful ebullience and that spiritual buoyancy and that confidence in the truth of God's word, and the love for the other person, and that hope that, 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 10, knowing the fear of God, we persuade people. Persuasion is possible. Speaking of which, there is another contentious issue that's circulating in the culture, the issue of gender dysphoria. And we did a video last night. I interviewed Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, who's on the Archbishop's Council of the Church of England, And he, together with some others, have put together a letter that's responding to the House of Bishops on the issue of gender transition services. So the House of Bishops basically came out with some guidance on how you could retailor a kind of a baptismal service for the purpose of a person being renamed and being called according to their new name, their new gender. And it was set out as guidance on gender transition services. That happened back in December, and quite a lot of people have been very uncomfortable about that, because it just seems to assume a whole bunch of theology and anthropology all in one big sweep. But how do you address the issue? Well, if you go to response2hob.co.uk, actually, is there any chance of you getting that up, Paul? Or is that too difficult? Don't worry, it's too difficult. But response2hob.co.uk is where a letter was put together by Ian Paul and others. And again, I think it's a really good model for how to try to persuade people, not just to double down and saying, this is our position and you're all evil, but to say this. So if you just scroll down underneath the photo, it says, gender dysphoria is an emotionally painful experience that requires understanding, support, and compassion. That's the front, that's the front foot. That's the introduction.
Yep.
Because it has affected a very small proportion of people, evidence from the medical and social sciences is often conflicting and of poor quality. Although gender dysphoria has been recognized for many decades, in recent years, controversial new theories about the relationship between biological sex and the social meaning of gender have been linked to gender dysphoria. These ideas continue to be widely contested, with well-intentioned and thoughtful people on all sides of the debate. Mm-hmm. A good way to lead into a persuasive argument. And so I was very impressed by this letter. I thought it showed a lot of pastoral care as well as theological wisdom. And so I thought I would interview Ian Paul, one of the authors of the letter. And we released that video last night on YouTube. We'll release it in full on Facebook tonight. But should we have a look at a clip from my interview with Ian Paul? Guidance that came out at the beginning of December. It says, the Church of England welcomes and encourages the unconditional affirmation of trans people equally with all people within the body of Christ, and rejoices in the diversity of that body into which all Christians have been baptized by one Spirit. What could we possibly object to in that?
I don't think the idea of unconditional affirmation, although it's really important in our culture and it seemed to be sort of the touchstone of acceptance, it's an incoherent idea. I mean, I can't find anywhere in the Gospels where there's this idea of unconditional affirmation. From the very beginning, right at the beginning of Mark's Gospel, Jesus comes out preaching, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the good news. This isn't unconditional. I mean, none of us are unconditionally affirmed. We are without condition welcomed into the possibility of hearing good news and repentance and faith. But that's not without conditions. I mean, Paul goes to great pains in his letters to say, look, if once you've heard the good news and you've repented and believed, if these things aren't evident in your life, then there's a question here. Are you, have you heard the news? It's not, I think the really helpful way of putting it is in John Barclay in his really, really big recent book on grace in Paul. He says that the invitation to grace is unconditioned. In other words, you don't need to tick a certain box before you hear it, but it's not unconditional, because that is just not faithful to anything that Paul says or that Jesus says. And every time, I mean, even people cite Jesus' table of fellowship, and he eats with sinners. Yeah, he eats with sinners in their homes where they've invited him, knowing that he's come to preach repentance to sinners. It's not the well who need a doctor, it's those who are sick. And in that, Jesus is saying, I'm coming to sinners like you and me. There is a sickness, and the sickness needs to be dealt with by the great physician. And he needs to do some, serious surgery in our lives. And that's true for everybody. Now, I can see why people want to use a language which doesn't differentiate and say that, people who are suffering from gender dysphoria are somehow in a special category that need. I agree that they're like all of us, but all of us come to not to be unconditionally affirmed, but to be received into the love of God and transformed by the good news.
It's interesting. About 10 years ago, I unearthed a quote by Rowan Williams, the then Archbishop of Canterbury, who said that the language of inclusion is not really the language of the gospel. The language of welcome is. And I thought that's a very interesting distinction. I think a very healthy one between inclusion and welcome. Because welcome, if I welcome you into my house, then there are still house rules, and there is still a shape to the table fellowship that I'm inviting you into. Yeah.
And of course, other theologians like Miroslav Volf have explored this. There's a really good Grove booklet by Edward Dowler, who is one of the signatories to the letter. He's the Archdeacon of Hastings, and coming from a more Catholic point of view, he used to be on the staff at St. Stephen's House. And his argument is that even before you get to theology, the language of inclusion is self-contradictory, because, inclusion includes only those who believe in your definition of inclusion. And actually, it draws a boundary around those agree with you on this, and actually we see that manifested in social media all over the place. People will be very inclusive until you say, actually, I don't agree with your definition of inclusion, and then suddenly you're out. Which is a bit ironic. So I think the introductory language here is just it should have no place at all in Christian liturgy.
So yeah, the difference between inclusion and welcome, I thought was interesting, and obviously the language of inclusion is very popular today. Everyone wants to be inclusive. Is there something different about being welcoming? And I do think that the Rowan Williams quote is really interesting on that. I dredged up the full quote. Where is it? Rowan Williams said, I don't believe inclusion is a value in itself. Welcome is. We don't say, come in and we ask no questions. I do believe conversion means conversion of habits, behaviors, ideas, emotions. The boundaries are determined by what it means to be loyal to Jesus Christ. So I just thought that was really interesting, that welcome is come over to my house, but in my house we do things this way, and there's a shape to our table fellowship, and anybody, absolutely anybody, is welcome at the table. But it's a table, and there's table manners, and I'm welcoming you into something that's going in a certain direction. Inclusion just seems to be just free for all, free for all. Just, hey, the house is yours, do with it what you want, and that kind of thing. But there's no direction. There's no shape to the life that you're including people in. Whereas very definitely what the gospel does is welcome everybody, no matter who you are, but welcome you into a pre-existing structure in which one of the things is there is male and female. And that might seem really binding and constrictive, but maybe it's actually the context in which you'll truly flourish, truly thrive, truly be free. It's worth thinking about. So I thought that language was helpful to get into. But on that topic of being included and simply being unconditionally affirmed in however you present to people, I thought Jordan Peterson did a really interesting
ding
Jordan
this
Peterson.
is Jordan Peterson bell.
We've rung the Jordan Peterson bell. We'll get a sticker later. And he just in 2.5 minutes, he really interestingly spoke about how what we really don't, even from a psychological point of view, we really don't want people to just affirm us. We really need for people to contradict us and to give feedback to us, and for us to fit awkwardly into a community and have to adjust, and they have to adjust, and that's actually going on in psychologically healthy communities all the time. And so to speak a language of pure inclusion without the need for any adjustment on anyone's part just doesn't work even psychologically. So let's have a look at Jordan Peterson's clip.
If the world is required to validate your identity, you're done for. And the reason for that is that every single one of you have a pathological direction in which you're likely to go. And that's because every temperamental virtue comes with a temperamental vice. And so the only, you think you're sane. It's like you're not. You're not even close. If I put you alone in a cave for 2 weeks, you'd be done. You can't. You can't be sane on your own. And so what happens is that your parents, if they have any sense, train you, roughly speaking, to be vaguely acceptable to other people, and they keep nudging and winking at you every time you're a moron, so that you get nudged into something approximating acceptable. And you're clued in enough to pay attention, so when someone raises an eyebrow or doesn't find your joke funny, or something rather subtle like that, you immediately revise your identity. And we're always nudging and tapping each other non-stop, exchanging information about how to stay sane. And if I'm forced into a position where I have to validate your identity, it's like, what if your identity is wrong? What if it's pathological? What if it doesn't serve you well? And I start validating, you think I'm your friend? I'm not your friend at all. I'm a mirror for your narcissism. And you will disappear and drown. And I see this happening all the time with people. Like, if you're fortunate, you're surrounded by people who like you now and wish you'd be a little better. And they'll let you know when you're failing on that. And then you think, you don't even have to think that much. All you have to do is watch. It's like, is this person like rolling their eyes at? That's a bad one. That predicts divorce, by the way. When you get to eye-rolling stage, that's not good. But basically, you know, you're fortunate that people don't validate your damn identities. Like, what makes you think you've got your identity figured out? You're really complicated, and you're clueless as hell about it, because you can't represent yourself entirely. You're the most complicated thing that exists. How are you going to come up with an accurate definition of your identity? You got 100 people out there helping you out if you've got any sense, if you're vaguely tolerable, and you know they're kind of hinting at you not only what you are, but what you might become. Man, you should welcome invalidation of your identity. Now, malicious, well, that's a different story, but it's not that easy to separate out accurate criticism, especially if it hits you right where it hurts, which is where you're wrong. You can't separate that out from maliciousness or hate speech. It's like, good luck. Good luck. You never learn anything without pain. And often when you receive a piece of corrective information from someone, it's like if you could throw that person in jail, you would. That doesn't mean they're wrong. So.
That was peak Peterson. That was absolutely
quality.
All the way down to finishing his answer to a question with, so.
Always. So the way he just picks up his drink at the end, like,
yeah,
that's it, I'm done now.
Mic drop. Yeah.
No,
Ian McCarthy's just said 39 minutes before a Jordan Peterson quote. Is this a record? It's holding out. Just don't do it yet. But yeah, the idea that we are to unconditionally affirm somebody's identity is right at the heart of what we think is like liberated, healthy, modern society. And actually, he's saying that no, this is pathological.
Yeah.
Have you ever done one of these? There are questionnaires you can do to figure out what gender you are. And
really? So the furthest I've ever gotten that is when it just says male or female.
Male or female.
And I say male.
Yes.
That's the only questionnaire I've really touched on in that area.
I hover. I don't know. I mean, I don't think any of us find our gender... I do, as a serious point, I don't think anyone finds their gender identity straightforward, you know. And I often hesitate to describe myself as a man. It's just like, I don't know. What does it mean? I don't know. But as soon as you start to then, move away from gender dimorphism, and you start to, well, maybe there's a place in between, and then there's a place in between those two things, and then there's another axis over here, and the number of genders kind of multiply and multiply, and maybe there's 53, maybe there's 72, maybe, how many genders are there? But you can do surveys and little questionnaires about what gender you are. And what's interesting to me is the experience of filling one out was exactly the same experience as when I filled out like a Star Wars personality quiz or something. Where you're just like, you're trying to think, and you're desperately trying to be Han Solo. Like what would Han say to this? And then
you are Wicket the Ewok. Like, you're like, yay.
Princess Leia. Literally. Emma and I did the same Star Wars personality quiz. I was Princess Leia. She was the Emperor. It's so perfect. It's so perfectly.
Man.
Yeah, and it does.
Itself.
It does. It does really fit, actually. But yeah, my experience of filling out like these gender questionnaires was very, very similar. Like let's imagine, let's take a dive into the deep waters of Lake May and let's swim around for a little bit. And then you come out, and of course you're not going to come out with, bog standard male. Like, how boring, right?
Yeah, what are the
you're
odds?
But what Jordan Peterson in that clip is saying is like, just because you've come up by yourself with your own sense of identity doesn't mean that's going to serve you well. It certainly doesn't mean it's going to serve the community well. And maybe the community is going to have some thoughts about Glen pulling his head in and just like not always insisting that people address me in precisely the terms that I want to be addressed by. And so I think there is a give and take and a back and forth that is required in all sorts of community living, and therefore we surrender the right to simply self-identify. Actually, I find my identity, I would say, in other people and in Jesus, right? And probably the last place I find my identity is looking deep within to the desires of my human heart, which are so deceitful and will change. And that's why you get gender fluid, because, one day I'm like this and the next day I'm like that. And that's all of us, actually. But if our identity is not anchored in Christ or determined by a broader community, then my goodness, we are just like corks on the tide, and we're going to bob this way and that way. And therefore, what is the most loving thing to do to someone who is a bit like a cork bobbing on a tide? Maybe it's not to unconditionally affirm that identity. And so one of the things that Ian Paul mentioned in our interview was this book by Mark Yarhouse. Get close in on that one. Understanding Gender Dysphoria by Mark Yarhouse. It is a very good introduction. Obviously, when he gets into the medical stuff and talks about there are just like 14 different experiences just of the intersex condition before you get into like gender dysphoria more broadly. So there's a lot of literature, and Mark Yarhouse does a very good job, I think. I'm trusting him of summarizing all that kind of stuff. And where he comes to in his book is he identifies 3 models of thinking about gender dysphoria. This sense that I am not at home in the gender of my birth, and I feel a certain level of discomfort with that particular gender identity. And so he says that there are 3 models of dealing with that. There's the integrity model, the disability model, and the diversity model. And the integrity model is sort of a traditional religious view, or a traditional sort of just conservative family values kind of view, that there's man and woman, and there you go, done. That's the integrity kind of view of things. And then there's the disability model, which foregrounds the kind of stuff I was just saying about I don't find my gender identity straightforward. I don't think anybody does. There's been a fall. We're all, and therefore the lens to look through when you're thinking about gender dysphoria is a disability lens. And again, you might think of something like an eating disorder in which perhaps there is a sufferer with anorexia who thinks they're fat, but their body says otherwise. Yep. And there is dysphoria. There is a disjunct between their mind and their body, and that's a disability. Of course, how you deal with that person, almost always, if you're dealing with the anorexic and they think they're thin, they think they're fat, they're actually thin, you want to change their mind,
change the thinking,
not their body,
physicality.
You could kill the anorexic if you actually want to change their body in accordance with their mind. You actually want to change the mind in accordance with the body. But yeah, there is that second model of disability, and then a third model to think about gender dysphoria is diversity model, and that tends to be the more progressive view that there are 70 plus genders, and that's great, and there's a rainbow spectrum, and that is a thoroughly good thing. And what Mark Yarhouse does, which I really appreciate, is he doesn't just hunker down in one camp or the other. And he actually says, look, there's something from all 3 of these camps that is useful, and is useful even for the Christian. So he has an integrative approach where he says the integrity people who camp out in Genesis chapter 1, that there's male and female, they honor the creation, and that's great. But then he talks about the disability people. Well, they camp out in Genesis 3, where there's been a fall. And that too is obviously biblical and really helpful. So there's a creation and a fall. And actually, he goes to the diversity people, the more progressive guys, and he says, they are doing an enviable job of building community, an enviable job of having coalition of people who are united around common values and finding their identity in thick communities of mutual belonging. And actually, as Christians, we need to be like that as well. So we need to have the best of creation, the best of fall, and the best of community. And so, I heartily recommend Mark Yarhouse's book, Understanding Gender Dysphoria, and that can be very helpful. So yes, Bill Lavelle says very highly recommended. Is he responding? Anyway, I'll just take that as unconditional affirmation of me. I don't know what you're referring to, Bill, but I'm gonna imagine that you're just unconditionally affirming me.
I'm sure he'll chime in, as he said, to let you know whether...
In the complicated splendor that is Glen. So yes, Mark House, Understanding Gender Dysphoria. And it's got me thinking, and let's just do this quickly, in trying to reframe things. And Mark House does, again, a good job at that. He says, I know you looked through the integrity framework. Have you thought about disability and diversity? And he does that for all the different frameworks, and he tries to get us to reframe things. And so a while back, maybe a couple of weeks ago, on Twitter, I just came out with a whole bunch of questions that you can ask people who have asked you difficult questions. And so under the hashtag questioning questions, if somebody asks you about transgender issues, for instance, what is a good response to that? And again, like, we might want to hunker down in... You've just read one tiny little bit of social science that was like cited on the Facebook page that you happen to like. But why don't you ask a question back? Why don't you reflect and reframe the issue? And so if somebody asks you about transgender issues, why don't you say, it's so tricky. Do you know how best to help those with gender dysphoria? Do you know how best to help people with identity disorders more generally? It's such a difficult issue, and it is absolutely a difficult issue. When mind and body don't align, what is the best way forward, do you think? And just start a conversation.
Yep.
So it's not about just giving the answer straight back, but it's about reposing the question back to the person. I had a great experience with this at Christmas. So a guy came up afterwards and he said, I really enjoyed the talk, but then he just kind of rattled off a series of hot button issues to gauge whether I was on the right side of history or not.
Yeah.
And front and center is like, what do you think about the transgender issue? And literally I was like, it is so tricky, gender dysphoria, like, what do you think is the right thing to do? And he'd never been asked that question. I don't think he'd really considered the question in terms of just pastorally, how do you walk someone through it?
I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure your answer's wrong. There was. If I can just put it in layman's terms for the listeners at home.
Thanks for translating. There was something of that to it. So just ask a question back, questioning questions. And I think this works in all sorts of areas. So another tweet that I put out there, if someone asks you about sexual ethics, just is your first response, I don't know what your first response is, but why not have a question as your first response? What do you think sex is for? Like, what do you think it's for? Are you open to considering that sex is more powerful and more meaningful than you thought? What do you think that Me Too has revealed about the power and dangers of sex? I think that's a good conversation. I think conversations around Me Too are really, really helpful, because everyone knows that when sex goes wrong, it's a car crash. It's more than a car crash. There's been a violation. There's been a desecration. Holy space has been violated. Therefore, you know that sex is kind of holy, right? So let's get into questioning the questions and say, what do you think sex is for? Why do you think it's so powerful? When someone asks about abortion, for instance, I think a good question back is, do you believe in human rights? What do you have to do to deserve them? If you could be convinced that the unborn are human persons, would you change your mind? So again, focusing in on the status of the unborn, and genuinely being interested in their question, in their answer, and helping them think through, do you believe in human rights? And I don't think people have thought that through very much. And, do you think you have to deserve your human rights? People, I hope, would reflexively sort of say, no. Okay, so you don't have to be a certain level of intelligence or strength. Oh, okay. Because actually,
and that comes on Stephanie Gray's thing, doesn't it? Or size.
Right.
Yeah. Like, once you're past an embryo or a fetus, which is really just a smaller stage of human development, it's not like, we apply that on any other stage, is it? So yeah, exactly.
So then, if you're asked about does science contradict faith, again, before before giving your side, why don't you just ask, do you think science and faith are enemies? Do you think they are necessarily enemies? Oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that? Get into that kind of thing. On the question of suffering, so important to figure out where people are coming from if they ask you a question about suffering, not just to download on them your theodicy, but like, what examples of suffering are you thinking about? Is it something close to home? That's really important to figure out, because if you just download a philosophical argument on them, and their dad's just died, you're gonna more than just miss them. That's gonna be really catastrophic. When people ask questions about judgment, here's one to think about. Ask the question back, like, what do you make of Martin Luther King when he said that the arc of history bends towards justice? Do you believe that? Do you believe that the arc of, what did he say? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Do you think we are heading towards justice, perfect justice? You know, he seemed to have that hope. Okay, what do you think that means for us at a personal level? If people ask about Old Testament wars, I'm doing this now more and more. It's just asking, like, tell me, do you have a place for just war in your thinking? Like, I don't know what you thought about Syria. I didn't think we should have bombed Syria. Are you a thoroughgoing pacifist? What do you think about just war? Is there a place for actually using violence? And if they say no, there's no place ever for that. I would then say, well, yeah, I take it you've got that view from Jesus. Actually, I take it you've got that view from the Sermon on the Mount. Even if they say they've got it from Gandhi, well, you know, Gandhi got it from Tolstoy. Tolstoy got it from Jesus. So, yeah, that's a question you can ask back. Do you believe in such a thing as just war? Even if, like, we might not have time to get into the details of the Book of Joshua, but do you ever think that there is a case? You know, what if there's a nation that's killing its children indiscriminately? Yeah, right.
On an industrial level.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and what if the arc of history is bending towards justice for those nations? Yeah, are they not under judgment? But anyway, and then finally,
we're going to be all over the media now. That's it.
Yeah. And then finally, what about hypocrisy? The hypocrisy of Christians, and again, it's really important when people say Christians are hypocrites to ask what examples do you have in mind, because it might be a really personal example. But just to ask the question, do you think hypocrisy is a Christian problem or a human problem? Like, what do you think? And let's answer questions with questions, reflect them back, reframe the discussion, relate personally to how you've been thinking about that issue, and then retell the gospel with this issue at its core. And maybe you'll be involved in persuasive evangelism.
Yeah.
You never know. Brilliant. Well, that ought to do us, I reckon. Yeah, so it's been great to have you guys with us. If you would like to support the show, we would really value a review on Facebook. Perhaps you've liked the page Speak Life on Facebook. Please do give us a 5-star review. That really helps us. If you like the podcast, please again give us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, please click like and subscribe, and share us on social media. It really helps us to get seen by more people if you just give a little word of commendation and share the link. And if you want to support us financially, you can go to speaklife.org.uk/give. We exist because of your generosity. So speaklife.org.uk/give. Excellent. Well, next week we're going to do what we promised this week, which is to have Andrew Wilson on the show. We put him off because of the House of Bishops thing. So he is in the can, and we will release him from the can Monday night on YouTube, and then we'll discuss it on Tuesday. So really looking forward to getting to that topic of spirit and sacrament. Eucharismatic.
Eucharismatic.
Eucharismatic worship. Yeah, no, it was a great conversation. Can't wait to share it with you. Well, that ought to do it. Guys, have a great week.
Yep, take care. We'll see you next time.
See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.